Yeah. So this is the 11th section of, or 11th session of the Stafford Beer Braid of the Firm reading group with General Intellect Unit. And this time we are going to review the previous sections of the book that we have discussed as sort of per Beer's suggestion. And because we have had new members join in over the course of the reading group, and because we just need to do the review for ourselves as we get into the sort of more practical dimensions of the text. So we'll start out at the beginning, page 3, the summary of part 1. So it says, we begin chapter 1 by trying to understand what is special about today's managerial problems. There does indeed seem to be something unique, and it has to do with the rate of change. It could be that the lags in our systems of implementation are longer than the average interval of new technological impacts. If so, there is bound to be trouble. The tool which might have coped with this problem, because it is fast and flexible, is the electronic computer. But we have not understood how to use it. This book is about what to do next. We need a new insight, which the science of cybernetics can provide. I like to see straightforward English whenever possible, but I have not been able to write this book without introducing some new terms. They are there to name new concepts or concepts which come from other sciences. So that would be the contents of chapter 1, essentially laying out the problem of accelerating change as a result of technological change. I think we're all fairly familiar with that concept today. It's quite an imminent and obvious issue. But does anyone have any sort of like looking back on this premise thoughts to bring up? All right. Well, I think we'll leave that as being quite obvious. And I think, we can definitely say, but the problems we're facing today are like governance problems, or they are epidemiological problems. But it only takes a very slight scratching beyond the surface to see the ways in which technology has fostered these problems. Right. So, our transportations and logistics networks, or, the degree of surveillance and military technology we see in policing, all that kind of stuff. Shane, go ahead.
I think there's maybe another tiny thing to kind of emphasize here, that I think Beer focuses on the rate of change because self-organization and homeostasis is kind of an ordinary trick. Like, it's a system stabilizing itself in the present is a kind of parlor trick that a lot of systems can do. Like a fucking cell can do it. But it's the stabilization over time and in the face of rapid divergent change is the kind of the meat of the problem. So for Beer, it's not so much that managing the first order activity is fairly trivial because stuff just does it anyway. Managing the second, third, fourth, fifth order, like derivations of activities is where the real interesting stuff gets,
Right. And we saw in studying System 4 that is really essential to being able to cope with rapid change. So that's a key point of what we're going to talk about. All right. So next we go to Chapter 2. If Chapter 2 is read carefully and the reader doggedly refuses to be put off, he will be armed with the first set of the tools he needs. There is a special glossary of cybernetic terms at the back of the book so that people can refresh their understanding if necessary. You may well find that these strange terms soon become old friends. They deserve to be, or I should not have bothered to introduce them. So, were there any terms that came up in recent chapters or in your readings that were just opaque and hard to understand? I guess aside from, like, the nitty-gritty of the anatomy that we discussed. Because this is the chapter where we see things like afferent, efferent, feedback, these kinds of concepts that were brought up. No, okay. Oh, Jake, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm still not sure if I totally have down pat, and I know you're not supposed to totally have them down pat exactly, but the notion of filtering exactly. Might be because it's been a little while since I refreshed myself on it, but it's to do with variety in meta languages, I think we were talking about at the time. But it keeps slipping my mind, that one.
Yeah, so that issue about meta languages comes up in a later chapter. But the more sort of fundamental stuff about filtering has to do with, Ashby's law of requisite variety, which, if I'm remembering correctly, means that you have to have at least as much variety as the system you're dealing with in order to cope with it. And if you don't have filtering that is like variety attenuation, you just you end up with sort of catastrophic increase in the amount of variety you need to deal with your situation. So you need filters that simplify the situation to a degree that you can actually cope with, or the system in question can actually cope with, so that it's not getting overwhelmed. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, we can relate this to our usual sort of empirical sensory kind of filters, right? That when we think of color, in our minds, we've got maybe, 25 colors that we can kind of imminently recognize without having to look it up in the table or whatever. Or shades of blue are in chunks basically for us, and it's kind of in our cognitive layer. But the actual material reality of what constitutes color is a truly limitless spectrum. It's like the real numbers. You pick any 2 points and there's always something new in between them. And this is just you can't deal with all frequencies of light. It's impossible. You have to be able to make a judgment as an organism, as a system that's actually trying to live in the world. You have to be able to make a snap decision of is that rustling over there in the bushes a tiger or a ferret? And it has to happen very quickly. And that just means that you can't contemplate every possible wavelength of light or every possible motion. It's impossible. So this kind of transcendental empiricism is just a general feature of the world. It's not just our minds that do it. Everything does it. Everything is insufficient with relation to everything else in terms of information processing. So filtering happens naturally. It's not even an active process that one decides to filter. It's usually something you don't get much of a choice in. It's just the structure of the world or the structure of the organism forbids total information.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel he uses filter in like a couple of ways. So I remember there was one that it sounded like by filtering it was kind of more of a reduce. He's talking about taking a mean or something, and but it's also chunking. It's like how you'll read old timey texts and they refer to every single grain as corn. Which is maybe kind of maddening. As a 21st century historian trying to figure out exactly what they were growing. But I mean, for their purposes, it actually works. So.
Yeah, there was definitely a discussion of compression that came up in the book. That was another sort of filtering method that Beer discussed. So Jake, please go ahead.
Yeah, another thing that just brought to mind that I think you were saying there, Kyle, is, or at least related, a couple of times has come up, what time period the system's operating on, whether or not it's minutes, seconds, or centuries or whatever, right? And I guess filtering is also relevant in that, the extent to which you could do filtering and the extent to which the variety that you're trying to attenuate. If you're in an insurrectionary situation, for example, you would have less time to be filtering, I guess, and that would change maybe the quality of the qualitativeness of your system. It would be a different system operating on that level.
Yeah, exactly. We can see today with the street fights, the revolting that's happening, the protests, the mode that people are engaging with the situation is a lot less contemplative than it might otherwise be. But that's basically a necessity that is derived from Ashby's law, right? Because you have to be more attentive to the immediate situation if the immediate situation is what matters, right? Like, you can't, just abstract everything when it's a question of, do I need to go up the street or down the street to avoid being arrested? So that kind of thing makes a lot of sense. Like, people might accuse the protests of being too in the moment and not contemplative or deliberative enough, but like, you can kind of understand the necessity if you look at this variety stuff. So we'll go to Jake and then Steve. Yeah.
Jake H, right?
Sorry, yes. Jake H.
I think he might have dropped a second.
Yeah, I think Jake's probably out. So, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, going off on what Kyle's saying, I mean, there's two things. So, like, one, like, finding that way of doing the filtering, as it relates to the meta language question, right? So what we really want here, right, is to be able to abstract the complexity to the appropriate representation that we can communicate via the meta language up the stream and down the stream, right? And that's obviously a challenge, and in many ways, like, depends always on the specific things upstream and downstream. But like, relating it to the current unrests, I think it's interesting that as we struggle collectively to figure out what the appropriate narrative is here, there's so many ways that people are trying to reduce, well, in a good way, in a sense, like, reduce what's happening to the sort of sloganeering we need to actually, like, make an exact change and win people over to what we're saying. I think the most effective representation of communicating this seems to be, to a lot of people, all these 10-second videos of cops being assholes that are being shared on media. But, like, beyond that, is defund the police the right representation and filtering that we need to, like, communicate to people? Is it, something more specific? Is it the very abstract and probably meaningless ways of, the way that you're going to hear it from the top, like our mayor here in Houston and stuff like that? Like, we need to all just the meaningless platitudes that it's so easy to fall into. Like, that's not an effective representation to communicate anything that will lead to anything, right? But there's pressure for it to be framed in that way. From the top. So I don't know, like, it's interesting because I don't know what the answer is here, but, like, how we frame and reduce the complexity of the chaos that's going on to something that can actually communicate an exact change. How do we figure that out? I don't know.
Right. Well, that's an interesting observation, right? Because it shows that slogans have value in this point of time, because when people are occupied with sort of the nitty-gritty of organizing or protesting or revolting or whatever, the amount of sort of, like, extraneous information they can take in is quite limited. So slogans do help with that in terms of sort of building common ground without a lot of explanation. So that's really interesting. Jake H, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. My internet's being a little weird, but it's definitely, like, I mean, it's hard to not think about the current unrest going on now and, like, relating all this to that. But just thinking about the way that the police lack the requisite variety to deal with the protests in any way other than violence. Like, their first reaction is violence, and that's just causing continued protests. And so it's interesting to see if this will be the breaking point that
the internet gets this revenge again.
May not be the breaking point of the state, but it was the breaking point of that message. So we'll have to perhaps Jake, are you back? Are you there?
I'm back. Sorry. I'm gonna move to another room in my apartment in a sec after I talk. But
okay.
Yeah, just I'm not sure where I cut out there, but
breaking point. You were talking about the breaking point.
Right. I mean, like, you know, Beers talks about system needing to be able to handle all the requisite variety or it destroys itself. Let's hope that that's happening with the police. I mean, I'm not gonna hold my breath, you know, just based on like the history of capitalism, but it's definitely interesting, and also just thinking about you know, the way that these protests have kind of like, I mean, people are concerned more with like how to do the things, right, and not so much about like the theoretical backing of it, but that what that means is that there are opportunities to like figure out solutions to like the problem of requisite variety or of condensing down the variety of like, here are all these people protesting, how do we condense it into useful information so that other people can join them or people don't get arrested? I think that's an interesting thing. I mean, in my organization, we're just using like a bunch of signal chats, which is useful because it's quick and it's encrypted, of course, but there is a ton of variety. You know, there's like, you know, I look away for a few hours and there's like 100 messages, which is good. It means people are doing stuff, but it's like tough to keep it going. And so we've got people who are like concerned with communication and are trying to communicate that to sort of a broader range of people who aren't necessarily like in the signal chat as like just like using the mass texting software. Of just like, hey, we need people at XY intersection, or just like tweeting out, hey, there's cops coming down the street, like don't go down the street, you know. And so I think it's an interesting way that it's just sort of self-organized.
Yeah, I mean, you need people like doing like this sort of system 2 and system 3 coordinating work. And you also need people doing the system 4 work in terms of like looking forward, looking out at the immediate context. All these things are important. Okay, so Brett, go ahead.
Well, and also with the signal thing, there's also the issue of like using the Black Lives Matter hashtag and people can't find anything because it's all like a bunch of black images. But there was also worse that we sort of started off this talking about. It also works on the other end of just like blasting K-pop videos at police, and they don't know what to deal with it, so they just shut these systems down because they don't have the system to deal with it. So it feels like anyone who has the most variety is the one who ends up overwhelming the system. I don't know.
I think, you know, we can look at this sort of tactically, and you see that it's not so much the one that has the most variety that wins. It's usually the one that has the best attenuation that wins. You look at the Roman legions and how they were able to win again and again against larger, you know, Germanic or other outside forces just because of their organization. But having a certain amount of variety is necessary. Yeah, Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Just to bring it in before, because I'm aware that it was a thing that was in the next channel, and just to bring it here because I think it's extremely relevant. We were discussing the fire in motion strategy, and I think it's a fairly old military strategy, but I think it's an interesting implementation of like balancing this thing of like actually actively using variety against the enemy. So the basics of the strategy is that you use suppressing fire to get the enemy to keep their head down, and you're not actually aiming to hit them. You're just firing wildly so that they have to stay in place while you move. Now, I first came across this concept through Joel Spolsky, who's a software engineer. He used to work at Microsoft and that sort of thing. And he observed that it's basically what Microsoft does. They deprecate an API or they re-engineer a toolkit basically every week, so that all people who are developing on the Windows platform spend half of their time keeping up with the bullshit changes and spend less of their time developing a competitor to Microsoft Office. The same goes for Google when they get to call the pace of browser development, meaning that Mozilla have to play catch up constantly because Google are generating new ideas for bullshit APIs on the web, and they're implementing them fast and fast and fast. So I think it's a mixture of both, right? I think Kyle has it on the money that it's the system that's better able to balance itself against its environment tends to win. But those systems can then actively deploy variety and chaff and noise and just I think what was Steve Bannon's thing, like flood the zone with shit or something, as a way of keeping everyone else's head down. So that's a very interesting kind of double pincer strategy.
Right. So in terms of fire and move tactics, the most obvious example I can think of out there is XCOM. So if anyone's played XCOM, you're very familiar with this tactic because that's all the game is. Yeah, like that kind of flooding thing, it can be quite effective, certainly. So, I was thinking there of the way that the IDF adapted Deleuze and Guattari to develop, new tactics about basically destroying the organization of the enemy by recreating urban spaces through just like violence, so that their previous organization would be disrupted. It creates noise in their system, right?
But even at that, they had like a high variety strategy of like just moving through walls, and suddenly you thought they were coming through the front door. Now they're fucking behind you already. Like that's high variety itself,
Yes. So that gets back to sort of like Boyd, and like outpacing your enemy, being a key component of victory, but I feel like we need to do a separate Boyd reading group. I don't think we can cover that here. Okay, so let's move on because we're on the clock and we should move on. Next, chapter 3, we start to use the tools. Here, the really fundamental problem of management is discussed and analyzed. It is the problem of complexity. How to measure it, how to manipulate it. We think of our problems as concerned with such things as men, materials, machinery, and money, and their interaction. It is just that interaction that causes the difficulties, and we must get at its nature. We must also get at the nature of the way huge numbers of states in a system soak each other up, which is the subject of Ashby's law. It turns out that organization exists precisely to implement that cybernetic law. There's much more about this later in chapter 15. I feel like we just discussed that, so we should probably move on. By the end of chapter 3, the fundamental reason should be clear why things cannot be organized down to the last iota, and why, in human terms, we should not even want to try. Of course, we all know that they cannot be so organized, that indeed an awful lot of things just organize themselves. But when we know exactly why, we can approach the problem of how. This is the subject of chapter 4, the nature of self-organization in very large systems. By understanding these principles properly, we may well be able to facilitate regulation without imposing it. And that is something all good managers try to do. There are some more new words here, which experience again shows to be useful to managers, with an account of a deceptively simple little machine I call an Algoda Node. I have explained why in the text. So here we have this idea of sort of very complex systems, or just the degree of the complexity of reality that comes up, which sort of proves that using this very this attempt to provide a completely holistic and all-encompassing simulation of reality is a fool's errand, and something that we like is just physically impossible. Were there any sort of questions about this? And then also we'll move on to the Algoda Node after that, I guess. All right. So about the Algoda Node, we talked about this last session. But did anyone need a refresher on that? What it was? There is a glossary definition in the back. So essentially, this is like a fundamental core unit for filtering, for attenuating variety, right? It's a way we can cope with a reality that is unfathomably complex and deep. So I think that's the core point of that chapter. Rudy, please go ahead.
So I have a thought about this. So the Algoda node is essentially a filter because it's supposed to be a filter, or because it's a very low variety communication channel?
So you're saying, is the design intent primary, or is it a coincidence that it's like this?
Yeah, kind of.
Well, I think the Algoda node was based on the synapse as an example, right? And so I think that it's drawn out of a few paradigm cases. So it's in the first instance, it's a model that's built off of empirical observation and then later deployed intentionally. Okay, so Steve, go ahead.
No, I guess kind of in response to that. I mean, I think one thing that I keep forgetting that I think it's worth thinking about, that I don't think is really drawn out too much in this explicitly, is that as Kyle was saying, it's what we're really talking about is an adaptive filter, right? So it's adapting to the environment in order to do the filtering it needs to, but which is great, but I think framed through the example of the Algoda node that he talks about, that he gives as an example, that doesn't have the same properties that the feedback loops that he talks about in chapter 2 do, that they will be if the feedback is there, eventually they will stabilize, right? We know that about the feedback loops mathematically, and that's control theory, and we understand that. But this complex adaptive filtering mechanism with that he gives the example through with the whole wooden and copper strips and that stuff, there's no guarantee that that will stabilize through adaptation to anything that's actually a useful filter. At least that's my understanding of it. I don't get the sense that there's any guarantee that that will happen. And, I think back to the homeostat example from Cybernetic Brain, right? Was that there just wasn't enough settling time, or was it just that, it wasn't hooked up appropriately correct such that it even could stabilize? I suspect it's the latter, honestly, because there doesn't seem to be a big theory in how you do this adaptation in a way that ensures that you get to homeostasis. And I feel like that gets lost with this discussion of the Algoda node, but maybe I'm just not understanding it right.
So I think you're basically correct that the Algoda node in any given instance is not guaranteed to stabilize. We did see in the last chapter we read, though, the way in which Beer tried to address this problem of stabilization, right, which was by sort of reciprocal learning within the system. And that, he argued, was an advance over what Ashby was able to theorize. Okay, let's go to Matt and then Shane.
Yeah, I think there kind of generally isn't really a guarantee, that things are going to stabilize. There's something kind of empirical, I think, about what kind of state and what kind of specific configuration is going to actually let you survive. I think it's part of why so many species just go extinct when there's a big change in their environment. And I think it's also part of why, most organisms are generally, organizations, once they've struck on something that works, they kind of want to keep doing that. But because there's no guarantee that, the next thing that they do, even if they use the same process that they use to arrive at this equilibrium, there's no guarantee that, they're going to arrive on something that'll let them be nearly as successful in the new situation.
Yeah, I'm reminded here of an example. So I can't remember the exact period or the year, but I know that there was a period where the English tried to invade Scotland, and the Scots came up with one useful tactic for beating the English. And they did manage to beat the English. But every time the English invaded Scotland after that, the Scots used the same tactic and were defeated every time. So they weren't able to adapt their tactics. They were just like, but remember how badly we kicked their ass that one time? That was great. Let's do it again. So yeah, this is just an example of that kind of sticking that happens. Shane and then Brett.
Yeah, I think the thing of it being an advance over Ashby is really the important point there. But like the first generation cyberneticians and up through Ashby were more concerned with like a single machine with a single objective, and it converges on the goal or whatever. Whereas by the time you get to Beer and later Beer, he's more concerned with these like open-ended exploratory kind of systems, because I think the statement is ultimately correct that there's no guarantee that any given machine will converge in finite time, right, or in a timely manner. But that's kind of not really the point for organisms and for like meta-organisms and so on, because even if they try to converge on a certain point, by the time they get there, the goal will have changed anyway, like the environment will have changed. So it's less useful to have homeostats that like Terminator style zero in on a particular point. It's much more useful to have these much fuzzier, more dynamic, open-ended meta homeostat assemblages that can like explore their futures. So the lack of ability to converge on a particular point is I mean, it's there, but it's not really what Beer is super interested in. He's more interested in the open-ended exploration of a space.
Yeah, I mean, he's concerned with it to the extent that the organism can achieve homeostasis and the best ways to get there, but it doesn't have to be a guarantee. Because there aren't really any guarantees in life except for, death and taxes, I guess. But maybe taxes, maybe not. We'll see. Brett, go ahead.
And even there, I mean, he uses a lot of, this is sort of what I wanted to bring up, is he uses a lot of bodily metaphors. And the thing is, the body can get to a converge on a certain point where you don't really want that. So, they're called autoimmune diseases. I have one. My body thinks that the vertebrae in my spine are a problem, and it tries to calcify them. And it's really good at calcifying things, and I don't want that to be calcified. I would like to be able to move my spine. Thank you very much. And it's just an example of a system that can sort of be very good at something, and even be very good at open-ending solving a problem, but it's like solving the wrong problem entirely.
Right. So then conscious effort is needed to move to a different homeostasis.
Yeah, like stretching, which is what I do a lot.
Right.
The roots from happening, right? Totally.
Okay, well, that's a very good example. Let's move on to the next section then. But why another new word? The answer is that no one has actually isolated this mechanism before, and therefore it has no name. We all know about it, but the intention of cybernetics is to try and make such vaguely understood tricks perfectly explicit and clear, so that we really know how to use them. In Chapter 5, the simple Algoda Node is used as a building block to construct a larger system. And the object of understanding that system is to discover the meaning of hierarchy in organizations. Hierarchies are needed for fundamental reasons given in logic when big systems are becoming organized. When they are translated into human terms, they seem to be all about power and prestige, with the result that people lose sight of their real nature and meaning in the system. By the end of Part 1, we should have glimpsed a totally new perception of the nature of management and of how to approach this task of organization and control. Please do not despair if the practical relevance of all this is by no means clear yet. As the preface says, Part 1 establishes some talk. We shall start talking this talk in Part 2. Okay. Jake H., you had something to say.
Yeah, I think this kind of like gets to what was brought up, I think, like when we got to this chapter, maybe it was like after that, whatever, of how Beer just assumes like total control by the managers or by the people in the like who control the system, without like kind of giving any thought to what does that mean, or like what does that mean outside of the context of work or outside of the context of like capitalism, I guess, of just like what, like how to establish control in a way that's non-hierarchical. But I also think like I also agree with what he's saying in that like hierarchies can be just like they can be just hierarchies, and they can be non authoritarian is kind of like a vague word, but like it can be a non punitive hierarchy, or it can be a good thing, you know, not even in like an anarchist context, I guess. But yeah, and just thinking about like something that I've thought about a lot, I think, from listening to the podcast, of just like hierarchies will tend to emerge, and if you don't have a way for people to like if those aren't revealed to people like explicitly, then people will kind of be locked out just due to those implicit hierarchies that form, like whether it's just like the hierarchy of social relations of just like, oh, I'm more popular, therefore I have more control over the system that you don't have. And so I think that's something that like this all like cybernetics in general, I guess, has made me like not, I guess, reconsider more, just like think about more, but I think it's important.
Yeah, so Beer is making a strong claim here that hierarchy is not simply desirable, it's necessarily implied by the logical structure of reality. So if he's right, we have to cope with that fact, and like navigate that reality. As for like his sort of approach towards like antagonisms within the firm or those kind of self-interested managers, we get things asides here and there. But what Jeremy was saying the other day, I believe, was that he's kind of trying to covertly undermine the common sense of management thinking in this book by actually suggesting management structures that do not imply corporate dictatorship, even as he is addressing people who will be corporate dictators. So yeah, I think that's kind of the approach he's taking here. Let's move on to Matt, and then Shane, and then Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, he's kind of like maybe intuitively like touching on, you know, the social versus technical like division of labor. You know, like he's stripping out, okay, like what's actually necessary about these layers of abstraction. And you know, like I really like having a good project manager. Like, you know, I don't want to have to, you know, like deal with like all this, you know, all these parts of an organization that like, you know, I don't know their internal representations and stuff. I want someone to filter all that. To me, in the language of my tasks, you know, like that's good. But, you know, he's also he's also talking about how, hey, you know, like, this isn't just an optimizing process right now. You know, like there are benefits to being at certain levels of abstraction. And, you know, like it is kind of revolutionary, you know, even in the 60s when he's writing this for managers to say, oh, well, let's actually try to separate these two things out, as opposed to just like saying, oh, we've got this gentry class that, you know, well, like, and one of its features is that, you know, like they get the wine and the cigars. You know, yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, in a sense, he's moving past the social division, or the division of the social product that is implied or stated in Smith and Ricardo, right? Where like their political economy like explicitly addresses the class structure of their time, and kind of says like, okay, given this class structure, what's the distribution that we end up with? He's kind of undermining that sort of obviousness. Okay, Shane, and then Jeremy. We'll move on there.
Yeah, I mean, he's disaggregating control from power, right? Like, control is not the same as domination. Like, control is just regulation, like in the technical sense. And regulation is just a feature of the world. Like, it's a feature of reality. It happens at all scales. So I think, I used to be involved in a lot of anarchist organizing and stuff when I was quite a bit younger. And something that really vexed me about that stuff, and that kind of really brought me away from it, was that people really couldn't disaggregate these things. Like, power relations are not identical to hierarchical structures, like structures are just general. So I mean, like you think like fruit, citrus, orange. There is a hierarchy, but there's no power relations. Like the citrus doesn't have any power over oranges. Similarly, in your body, like there are cells inside your heart, but the heart doesn't like boss them around or anything like that. And so I think there's a big trap there, a hole that people fall into, and I've seen them fall into it over and over again, where they identify like any kind of regulation or organization with power relations. Like when they hear, some sort of structure that like demarcates, like levels of control, they instantly just envision the whip hand that's about to hit them. And so that's at the end of that path is basically Ted Kaczynski primitivism, where you would prefer to destroy society entirely rather than live with it. So I think it is very, very important to disaggregate those concepts.
Yeah, you kind of end up with that sort of like, Uncle Ted or like radical communizer sort of thinking, because of an inability to think out of that problem. Jeremy, go ahead.
So we haven't gotten there yet, but in chapter 14, the multi-node system 5, he basically, I think it's one of the best satires of CEOs I've read, where basically it says, if you have a lone decision maker at the top, it's pretty much categorically impossible that they can have the right information to make decisions even if they want to. They're basically fucked. And the only way to unfuck them is by creating so many interlocking networks that are highly, highly, highly redundant, that mesh makes the decision. But what that means is that nobody can really be the boss. What they can do is have a collective will to do System 5 functioning. And so this, in Platform for Change, there's a part where he's talking about looking out the window and seeing hippies smoking weed in the park, and says, these people think they're going to change the world, but I could take a team of managers, get them to learn my ideas, and they could change the world far more rapidly. And so you get a real sense of what he means by manager in this sense. The idea is that the managers are all the cells in the multi-node, and that it's the multinodal decision-making system that's going to change things, not some bastard at the top who barks orders into a telecom system.
Right, so the hippies tried to do the march through the institutions, but, we got the worst timeline where they went in without a strategy, or just a new left strategy, and got their heads handed to them. Okay, so hopefully we can do better. But I do appreciate this mention of the multi-node, because that could be a good steering concept for us to go forward. So that brings us to part 2. I'm just checking our time here. Okay, we've got half an hour left, so let's pick up the pace of the bit. Before beginning the analysis of part 2, it would be an excellent plan to read once again the summary beginning part 1. Done. We can now.
We can't read it again.
Yeah, let's go back. It's a bad loop. It's go to part 1. We get to part 2, go to part 1. You never finish the book. All right. All right, we can now start talking the talk. The object is to construct a model of the organization of any viable system. The firm is something organic which intends to survive, and that is why I call it a viable system. There are many examples of such systems in nature, yet instead of using any of those, which are known to work as models of the firm, we try to use organization charts that are really devices for apportioning blame when something goes wrong. They specify responsibility and the chain of command instead of the machinery that makes the firm tick. The problem is discussed at the outset, Chapter 6, as is the very nature of a model. Models are more than analogies. They are meant to disclose the key structure of the system under study. So if we want to understand the principles of viability, we had better use a known-to-be viable system as a model, and that is why Part 2 embarks on an account of the way the human body is organized and controlled by its nervous system. We could have used another viable system, such as the amoeba or a whole animal species, as the model. The results are the same as they must be if viability as such has its own laws and enshrines its own principles, as cyberneticians contend. But the human body is perhaps the richest and most flexible viable system of all. Besides, there is an extra advantage. All of us have bodies, and inevitably we have a good deal of insight into their characteristics. Most people know little, however, about how it all happens. For that reason, there has to be quite a lot of explanation about the physiology of the nervous system. You can see why I'm not too embarrassed about putting this forward. After all, any human being is likely to find his own neurophysiology interesting, whether he is studying management or not. You will find, though, that this book continuously compares the unfolding story of corporate regulation in the body with its manifestations in the firm. The process begins in Chapter 7. So Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Chapter 6 kind of gets at what we are doing here, what viability is, and what kinds of models we might want to use. Was there any sort of points there? I see Joe, have your hand up.
Yeah.
You're breaking up, Joe.
Seems to be better now, I think.
Okay. Seems a bit better, yeah.
So I'm not sure about like a whole species. That seems like, I don't know, somewhere in the Discord, somebody mentioned the difference between autopoiesis and I think it was ecopoiesis. It seems like, I don't know, maybe they're both viable systems, but there seems to be a lot of differences between them as well.
Yes, definitely. Again, the viability is determined in terms of the system under question, right? So if you're considering the species in terms of the reproduction of the species, that could be a viable system, but it's not viable in exactly the same way as the individuals of that species are viable. They have their own organization. Because, it's the species is inherently social in a way that, individuals are somewhat less so. But nonetheless, if the species is to survive, you do need some kind of viability at the species level. So yeah, again, that's separating out the layers of analysis and what you're exactly looking for. I think we talked about in the discussion something like Bain Capital, which can just like devour its constituent parts in the pursuit of its own viability. But obviously that doesn't create viability for the firms that Bain Capital takes over. It's not designed to do that. So I think that's a major point there. Another one that was brought up in the chapter itself, Chapter 6, was ecologies. And Beer sort of says they don't have enough, they're too swingy and they don't have enough forethought to be as good of an example as a human. And again, like, I'm skeptical that humans really are the best example, but I can kind of buy what Beer is saying about how we have intuition about our own bodies that's useful in understanding what's going on. I think there's probably viable systems we're just not really conscious of that are probably better at doing stuff than we are. Just a guess, Jake P., go ahead.
I would love to see someone from this group or someone adjacent to it do like a breakdown on the level that Beer does of the body, like on the level of like I don't know, like a party or something like that, something like a lot more familiar. And I'm sure he does it in his other books, right? But yeah, like things with multiple people, maybe with competing interests, maybe with, competing interests outside the system, which obviously the human body also has, but things that are more imminently graspable, I guess.
Sure, right. There's something counterintuitive, right? Like that we have some intuitions about the functioning of our own body. We have our experiences with the functioning of our own body. But the physiology is so alien to us that paradoxically it actually becomes harder to understand than organizational examples, right? So, I don't, there's problems with Beer's approach to instruction here, because I've definitely seen that, like, yeah, when you get into the nitty gritty of the physiology, it's actually harder to understand than the organizational examples. Still valuable stuff there, but I don't think his betting on people's intuition is really quite as effective as he hoped it would be. Brett and then Matt.
Well, another thing to consider is that I don't think it's really necessarily just the human body that's viable. It's all of humanity, like, over time, because humans die out really quickly sometimes, right? Like, that's just a genetic thing where you get a genetic disorder, you just die. Like, that happens. So I don't think, and that's super non-intuitive, and that sort of goes talking to more about the socialist stuff that we're talking about in terms of, like, how to do hormone organization in a way that is viable.
Right. Yeah, and, if we talk about, like, a problematic, like the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, we need to think about viability beyond even the human species, just to ensure the viability of the human species. Joe, go ahead. Matt, then Joe.
I think part of the way it goes with the biology, though, is just that, like, your physiology actually is like a certain level of viable, and like honed over however many millennia. And I'm pretty sure Beer thinks like the overwhelming majority of organizations are really just non-viable, but like they're big enough that they the process of them dying just like happens on a time scale that a non-viable company can still take a couple of years to actually dissolve. So, I think Beer thinks that, like, most human organizations just aren't anywhere nearly as viable than biological ones.
Yeah, I mean, they might be hyper-stable in the way that he discusses in Platform for Change, but I think he's ultimately skeptical about the viability of our social form as a whole, including the organizational forms we have. So that sort of thinking from the point of view of civilizational crisis or social crisis, I guess, it's exactly as you said, Matt. He has a certain degree of faith in the proving grounds of evolution and what that has given us. Okay, let's move on then. Chapter 8, by Chapter 8, the story is developing well. We are dealing with one of the most vexed questions in modern management, the topic of autonomy. If a division of the firm were really and truly autonomous, it would not be part of the firm at all. In the same way, if the heart or the liver were really and truly autonomous, they might decide to renege on the body. On the other hand, if the heart and liver were not more or less autonomous, we would have to remember to tell them what to do all the time, and we would be dead in 10 minutes. In the same way, if a division of the firm is not more or less autonomous, the main board has to run it directly, which is equally impossible. Besides, the divisional staff would resign. The body has understood this dilemma for several 100,000 years, and we can learn from it. Its solution is called the autonomous nervous system, appropriately enough. By the end of Chapter 9, we shall have seen how it works, and we shall also have worked out its relevance to the management task. 3 vital systems are identified as prerequisites of all autonomous control. Okay, so we're dealing here with autonomy versus cohesion. and we're dealing here with the way in which the human body deals with this problem. Jeremy, go ahead.
So we're seeing this in real time right now with the New York Police Department, where the NYPD, is it part of the city of New York? Is it an autonomous part of the city of New York? It's exerting levels of autonomy that are absolutely unsustainable. Like, it will not obey the system it sits in any way, which would make it autonomous. But if it's autonomous, then it shouldn't be receiving funds from the system. So it's turning full-on parasitical, where it sucks major resources out of the system, but doesn't obey the dictates of that system. And we're just watching it spiral out of control, and its response is to get more and more violent and to extend that violence to more and more of the citizenry it historically had left exempt from its reign of violence.
Right. Exactly. It's really only got like one strategy, and it's just putting that into hyperdrive, and pursuing its corporate interest over the interest of the U.S. state as a whole. Because originally,
what's horrifying about it is it's doing it with the compliance of the mayor and the governor, because they're very clearly fucking terrified of these psychos. Like, the mayor's daughter has been doxxed by the cops. The police union openly threatens the mayor on Twitter, and yet they continue to sort of barf these apologetics for the police in a way that's completely insane.
Yeah, it reminds me of going back to Japanese history, where the bushi, or the samurai, took over state functions from the imperial governance structure when they were originally created to defend that structure. So, yeah, we're seeing a kind of similar problematic happen here. Jake, H, and then Rudy.
Yeah, definitely agree with all that. I think, like, it's interesting. It's sort of like autonomy as like kind of a spectrum. Like, you can be autonomous within bounds that allow it to still function as part of the whole system, which is, I think, what Beer's talking about, if I'm not wrong. And so I guess it's just interesting to think of, like, what do those bounds look like, and how can you still allow for, I mean, I guess it's like having a system with enough requisite variety to, like, allow for those kind of testing of the bounds, or not testing, but like expansion of function, but still staying within the bounds of, like, you're still part of a functioning system, which clearly, like, that, yeah, the NYPD is not doing. I mean, I guess it could depend on what your view is of, like, the function of the system, right? If you view it as protecting capital, then, like, yeah, okay, it's kind of working within the bounds of that. I mean, it's not doing it in the best way. It's not the most effective way, probably, but, you know, it's still trying to protect capital and stuff. And I agree, like, they don't really seem to have any methods besides just horrendous violence. I think I also saw that something like some leaked chats or private emails or something from NYPD officers, like, where they literally, like, threatened to kill, like, de Blasio. Like, they were just like, we should just kill him, or something to that effect, which is just wild. But yeah, it's just, I definitely like his ideas of autonomy and, like, permitting autonomy, which is, I think, the whole point of, like, the idea of, like, the system one being basically given as much autonomy as necessary, and just, like, the linking up of that with the rest of the system as, like, a way to prevent it from being that top-down kind of, like, wait until the boss tells you what to do kind of thing, which is horribly inefficient.
Right. And one thing that comes out of these chapters, from what I remember, is that you need to have systems that are balanced against each other in order for this to operate. And that kind of feeds into the idea of the multi-node, right? Like, the multi-node is not unitary. It's performing a unitary function or an integral function, but it's not unitary in itself. And like if you look at the brain, we have all those different suborgans that are operating in concert with each other through sort of like semi-cooperative, semi-antagonistic functions. Rudy, let's go to you.
Yeah, I keep thinking about this because I remember one time we had a discussion and somebody told me that racism is necessary for American capitalism, but racism goes much further than American capitalism would like it to go. And like the police is just a manifestation of this in some ways. And, you know, when is like, I guess the idea of a counterbounding force is capitalism has to somehow develop a counterbounding force to the police, or the police will just destroy the whole system. It's a very interesting thought. Like following on what Kyle was saying.
Yeah, there are ways in which racism actually works against the logic of capital accumulation when it gets excessive, right? So you could look at, you know, the Civil War as an example of that. You could look at affirmative action as like a countervailing force that was set up within the system. You could look at the way in which the Supreme Court became activist, and it for a brief period of time to try to address this problem. All kinds of things, but you know, clearly it ain't working right now. It hasn't been for some time. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, it's unwilling to do the kind of inhibition that would be necessary to kind of restore balance, right? Like, and there's something about these degenerated neoliberal states that are because the state has been lobotomized so badly, it's really not able to keep any of its stuff under control. So the excitatory circuits just take over and they go nuts, right? And yeah, I mean, it finds itself in a position of like losing control of something that was instrumentally useful before, but like, you know, they don't even have the cognitive framework in which to think about inhibiting this stuff, because like it's impossible to entertain the possibility of even disciplining the police, let alone disbanding them. Like that just shows you how far that stuff is melted down. It's like you can't even think about fucking slapping these in the wrist at least. You know that if that's not entertainable, there's no fucking chance they'll ever get them under control. You know. So that like the whole thing of like, oh, give me as much oxygen as possible. Oh shit, oxygen's dangerous, right? Like, and that's the kind of dynamic equilibrium that balances oxygen levels. The one that keeps it down is gone, and it's just oxygen fucking poisoning and flooding the rest of the system, because the lungs love to fucking pump oxygen. You know, that's what they want to do. So that's what the autonomous system of the respiratory system wants to do. But the counterbalancing forces are just not there. And it's the payoff of a really reprehensible investment in this kind of stuff in the early capitalist states, right? They were able to use this kind of stuff to bootstrap themselves, and it's like, oh yeah, it's the solid days now. We've got all these shitty cops keeping everyone in line. But then it's like, no, the cops are going to kill you now. It's you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's numerous historical examples we could point to of that, but what's one we're in now? Let's go to Third Creed.
It's sort of tangential, so if we're in a crunch for time, we can just skip it. What do you think?
We may want to skip it then, because we've got we just have to cover chapter 10, right? And then we're done for the recap.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So we'll talk about chapter 10. If we have time, we'll come back. We got 10 minutes left. So, in part 2, cybernetics in the final chapter 10 of this part, the need for a system 4 is disclosed. Systems 1, 2, and 3 are concerned automatically with the regulation of internal stability. But the organism needs also to maintain dynamic equilibrium with the external world. More than that, if the challenge of change and increasing complexity discussed in part 1 is to be met, there must be systems for arousal and adaptation. All this is modeled by the brain. before the level of conscious direction attributable to the board of the firm and to the cerebral cortex in the brain is reached. That final level, System 5, is reserved for discussion later. So here we had the discussion of System 3 as inherently sleepy, basically inhibiting or filtering a lot of information from System 4 and System 5. And then System 4 and System 5 kind of doing arousal to check in and to act on an emergency program when necessary. So I think those were the core points of Chapter 10. Were there any others that, like, you know, people remember, they like to bring up, or or we can go to Third Creed's point. Third Creed, what were you going to bring up there?
I was just thinking about like how, like what I used to think of as sort of cultural hegemony is sort of how this is used. How people have struggled so hard to understand the systems that they're contained within. It's because they exist entirely within a meta language that was prepared for them to think only in that particular system. And there's a bunch of people with a bunch of different ones of these, and there's no sort of overarching vocabulary to talk to every single person. So just kind of like that sort of like hegemony of language actually being like injected into the meta language of you, so that like if you're a cop, like you have sort of a set of ideas, narratives, and symbols of like, oh, the brotherhood and like the fraternal order and all this, and the boys in blue and the blue line, and you have all this like these symbols that are made to make you do your job without understanding really even what the outcome of it is. You see yourself doing the violence, and you get the carrot, or you tell on the other cops and you get the stick, and that just kind of trains you to do the thing you're doing. And then it's just a bunch of people doing this, and that's more like the structure of like hegemony. It's not like a single ideology permeating the entire structure. It's a bunch of different like cooperating meta languages that like I don't know. It just occurred to me this week. I was thinking about some things I saw, and I know it's sort of tangential, but
no. Like, I think we didn't really dig into that idea of meta languages too much in this review, but that is certainly relevant. And like, you know, we can kind of see like Marxism as like an attempt to develop a meta language for the proletariat for itself, right? It's breaking with the sort of limits of what is available to the proletariat as workers. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, this stuff is very important, actually. It's not even really a tangent, because I think this relates to the conditioning that Algoda nodes go under, right? Like the general training of how to respond, because this does relate to the autonomy point, right? Like, I think it's in Heart of the Enterprise, Beer uses the example of the traffic laws and the rules of traffic. So in general, the traffic system, you want to control for divergences from the road. Ideally, the ideal homeostasis is where every vehicle goes where it needs to and none of them crash, right? That's the invariant you want to hold. Now, you could centralize the whole thing and have every position and velocity of every vehicle be calculated centrally, but it's completely infeasible. So what you do instead is you get intelligent agents, people, to drive the cars, and you give them relatively simple instructions. You train them how to do things on your behalf locally in such a way that adds up to something global. So the rules of the road are system 2 and 3 in that example, right? And it's similar, right? Like, if you want to oppress people, you can go around, you could go around with a clipboard and fucking oppress every single one of them individually. Or you could get intelligent agents, cops, and give them very vague and simple instructions about how to do your will locally on your behalf. And that is really important. That's the up-down kind of loop of a lower system being trained by a higher system to carry out instructions on behalf of the higher system without full intervention, because you can't like have, you can't have the probe go into every cop's head. You have to allow them to do their own thing. And the best way to do it is kind of train them to be shitheads in general. If you want a ghastly outcome, train them to be ghastly people in general, and then it'll all work itself out from there. This is really, really relevant stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same way you train a guard dog, right? Yeah. And guard dogs typically very nasty because of the abuse they've suffered. All right. So, in part 2, cybernetics is put to work to create a model of the management of any viable system. There are passages of fairly tough going as the nature and the implications of some of the neurophysiology are elucidated, but remember that once the issues are properly understood, there will be no real need to remember all the details. So let's bear that in mind as we go into part 3. Glossary is there for our help if we need it. So thank you everyone for participating in this review. Next time we will move on to part 3 of chapter 11, and I'll see you then.
Wonderful. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.